Hi, everyone. Really excited for you guys to hear this episode. It's on Djuna Barnes's novel Nightwood, which is a sorely neglected, I would say, modernist masterpiece, even. And it's something John and I have been wanting to talk about for a while because we feel like everyone who kind of talks about it just kind of waves their hands because it's incredibly dense, incredibly beautiful, and it offers no easy answers. And so we go a little long in the tooth on this one, but we're really happy for you to hear it. We're also happy to welcome to the pod friend of the show, Anna, for this episode. It's one of Anna's favorite books. So without further ado,
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Infinite Library. Thanks for joining us again this week. We have a very special guest tonight joining us here. Her name's Anna, and she's my girlfriend, and it's her birthday. Happy birthday, Anna.
Thank you.
yeah, happy birthday to friend of the pod, Anna.
And for those wondering, yes, getting to come on the show is my gift to her.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
All right. Well, Anna, we're here to talk about one of your favorite texts, a text that you actually introduced me to. I had honestly never heard about it until you told me about it, which is a little surprising given kind of the heritage of this text and kind of what it led to. But we're here to talk this week about Nightwood by Djuna Barnes.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we wanted help for this one is because Nightwood by Djuna Barnes is sort of a crazy book. There's a lot going on in terms of the style, the relationships, the content, the author's relation to the topic. And when you read it, you're just kind of like, in the introduction of my copy, the author compares it to drinking a glass of champagne with a pearl dissolved into it, which I think is the right metaphor for this kind of book. And we're like, we got to have Anna on the pod to talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this was a book that I stumbled upon on accident because I read Giovanni's Room, and my mother is an English teacher, and she said, "Oh, you like Giovanni's Room? Why don't you do Nightwood?" And yeah, I'm obsessed with it. It's kind of crazy to me that it's not very often mentioned in like the canon of modernism.
Well, yeah, because like Djuna Barnes used to run with a lot of the expatriate modernists that were in Paris, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Fitzgerald, a lot of people. And she was often writing about them because she was a journalist. And, she deserves, I think, to be brought up with them. But she's not, for probably sexist reasons.
Yeah, it's really strange because that, a couple weeks ago, Ben, we talked about The Fraud, which is a book that's very concerned with kind of a separate but similar kind of demimonde of writers in a certain period in history. And yeah, the expatriates in kind of 1920s Paris, Hemingway and all those guys, it's, I'd say, really one of the last like kind of great chapters in like literature as most people kind of understand it. Like I can't think of another time people are nostalgic for literature in the way that they are for kind of that period of time. Certainly nothing post-war, I think, really measures up just in terms of the way that people talk about the people involved in it and really kind of make them these mythological figures.
Yeah, could you imagine Woody Allen making Midnight in Paris about the Iowa Writers Workshop? I couldn't.
Then please do not speak such a horrible thing into existence.
Raymond Carver, we got to get Raymond Carver on the screen. So, but anyway, yeah, exactly, John. It's not valorized quite as well as, it's valorized more than other literary periods.
All right. Well, so listeners, you might tell we're a little cagey about where to get started with this book. It's a surprising book in a lot of ways. It's a book that, again, like I said, I'd never heard of it. It clocks in, at least my edition from Faber Modern Classics, clocks in at a slim 153 pages. Despite that fact, this is easily one of the most complex texts I think, have read for the pod so far. There's so much going on here in terms of what it says about sexuality, about politics, about life, to be a little trite, that it really feels kind of hard to find the right point of entry to discuss this book. So why don't we kind of take a little step back? Ben, I know you did a little research on kind of Djuna Barnes' personal history, and maybe because she has been so given such a short shrift by the literary establishment, if you will, maybe we can learn a little bit about her and kind of where she fits into this wider picture of literary history that we talk about sometimes here on the show.
Yeah, and one thing I think that's important about Djuna Barnes is also that I think in terms of American writers, she's one of the great sort of like self-inventors. And I think one of the reasons I would fit her into American literature is like a lot of great things about American lit are people that basically figure out how to write on their own. They're inspired by things, but they don't necessarily go to school for writing, and they're not educated in some sort of system. And I think that's something that's important about Djuna Barnes. And as a quick side note, I did first hear about her. It was a list online in terms of what are the great American sermonizers. And it's like people that write sermons. And it was like Thomas Pynchon, Herman Melville, Frederick Douglass, and then Djuna Barnes was on here. And like you, John, I was like, I've never heard of this woman. And so like I looked her up and I was like, damn, this is crazy. And I think one of the characters, we'll talk about him, Dr. Matthew Mighty Grain of Salt Dante O'Connor, is a great sermonizing character, which we'll talk about later. But that's sort of the context that I had first heard her in. So a little bit background about her is that basically she was born in a log cabin on Storm King Mountain near Cornwall and Hudson, New York. Kind of an incredible location, if you ask me, in terms of name. And her grandmother was a writer, journalist, and women's suffrage activist. And her father was a unsuccessful composer, musician, and painter. And I think so it's important that she was sort of raised in this sort of like artist atmosphere. Although her father was an unsuccessful basically composer, and he was a polygamist. His mother, Djuna Barnes' grandmother, was very supportive of him, Djuna Barnes' father, even though he wasn't a successful artist. And, he was married and he also had a mistress. So there was a lot of children in the household. Her father also believed in unlimited procreation, which might have influenced some of Djuna Barnes' later views on sexuality and birthing. But so there was a lot of children in the house and nobody was taking care of them. And so it was often left to Djuna Barnes to do this. And they didn't have a whole lot of money. So at one point they decided to literally split the family up, at which point Djuna Barnes moves to New York. And she basically gets involved in the, Greenwich bohemian scene there. She gets a job as a journalist, and she is quoted as saying, I can read and I can draw and I can write, and you'd be a fool not to hire me. And so they immediately hired her, and she actually got a big reputation for kind of what I would say is gonzo style journalism. So she was actually like, taking part in fasting and force feeding that currently suffragists were doing. She was attending boxing matches, at which point women weren't really allowed to visit. She has a piece titled, What Do Women Want in a Fight?, which I think is a great title. And so she was sort of already kind of setting the mold for journalism. And then more or less, she gets jobs covering the expatriate scene, as we talked about, in Paris. And she profiles James Joyce and those kinds of things. And she writes a couple of novels that are interesting for style. One of which, Ryder, her first book, was really influenced by Ulysses. But the big one today, obviously, is Nightwood, which came out in 1936. And a lot of Nightwood is sort of influenced by her personal life. And Anna, you were talking about this. What are the details from her personal life that come up in this?
Yeah, so she was actually in a relationship with an artist named Thelma Wood around the 1920s while she was living in Paris. I believe in 1927 she moved in with Thelma Wood. And she actually dedicated Writer and Lady's Almanac to her. But then they later separated. because Barnes wanted to be monogamous and Thumblewood did not. And there's a great like direct quote from her that she quoted saying that Wood wanted her along with the rest of the world. And actually, Thumblewood ended up with an heiress named Henrietta McCree Metcalf and moved in with her. And it's very clear that the character of Jenny Petherbridge, which we'll get to later, is like directly dunking on Henrietta McCree Metcalf.
Yeah, she's referred to as the squatter for reasons we'll explain later.
It's really interesting. I feel like something that we've brushed up on a little bit here and there over the course of the 11 episodes of the podcast so far is that these things we think of as being very recent inventions in literature a lot of times aren't. And I feel like Nightwood in a way is almost kind of a precursor to like what we would today call like autofiction. I think it's much better than most like autofiction today because it's being written by someone who's like a great stylist and actually lived an interesting life instead of just being a Trustafarian in New York going to shitty Peter Thiel parties with Anna Khachiyan.
And talking about what is true.
But yeah, the fact that like this book seems like it's so directly drawing on her personal life makes it an even more interesting book than I think it would be otherwise, which it already is. But the fact that there is this core of truth to it, this is someone like bearing their soul in a very real way.
Yeah.
And in a way that like is ugly, but also beautiful and like ambiguous. Like I really want to get into kind of the kind of tragicomic nature of this text as we discuss, but the fact that, yeah, you can just smell the resentment in certain passages towards characters who are clearly based on people she knew in real life and did not like.
Well, and too, also sort of she's writing about, lesbian relationships way before that was a thing. And importantly, she didn't actually like getting labeled as like a lesbian author or that this was a lesbian book, even though it deals with like love between women and other sort of gender issues. And I think that's also an interesting sort of author-text relationship, and that there are people who claim this as being a, canon of lesbian literature, and the author herself goes, I didn't want that. I was never a lesbian. I just love Thelma, was her quote, which I think is also really interesting in terms of like even autofiction or death of the author, like claiming something as being part of the tradition versus like neglecting that or denying it.
Yeah, the more I kind of read up on this book, it's got a really interesting place, and I guess we'll say the canon. It's what I kind of think of as like sub-canonical texts, where again you have the canon, you have Dickens and James Joyce, and those big names where it's like even people who don't read know those titles, those authors. And then you have again people like Djuna Barnes, who people who read have heard of this book, and even maybe people who haven't. Maybe people who do read even haven't heard of her, but there is like a kind of level of the literary world where this is a canonical text. And from what I could tell in kind of my supplementary reading for this week, that's very much kind of the queer lit sphere, the queer theory sphere. And I think you mentioned this to me as probably it's typically thought of as kind of the first text in kind of modern English lit that's directly dealing with like a lesbian relationship, in a non kind of metaphorical or like elided way.
Yeah, I think there was a book of poetry, and forgive me, I don't have it pulled up, that she published very early on too, like I believe before 1920, that was very like non-metaphorical about like a lesbian relationship, and it made it through. Like nobody stopped it because they couldn't even comprehend that it was published.
Wow.
But I don't know if she is the first, but she's definitely one of the first.
Yeah. Like again, it's so interesting that again she despite the fact this book has been taken up so strongly by queer readers and queer critics, I do think it's really again that makes that fact that she did not think of herself as like a lesbian. And another quote I saw from her was like that she did not want this book to like create a bunch of little lesbians. It's so interesting. Like,
yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's someone, again, kind of rejecting the heroic status kind of being offered to them in a way that you don't see most writers doing.
Also, I didn't mention this, but sort of when she does break up with Thelma in her actual life, things are very difficult. And she wrote this play, The Antiphon, which, is, I don't know if we have time to get into, but it was sort of like her kind of exercising some demons from her life. And then she just kind of moved back to Greenwich Village and was like a recluse for like 40 years. And like people would try to like come talk to her and she just wouldn't talk to them. And there's a famous story that E. Cummings used to yell every time he got out of his apartment because he lived near her, "Are you still alive, Djuna?" So because she was just the old lady that lived in her apartment and drank a lot. And she apparently was writing, but she didn't show anyone that except for the Antiphon, which came out in 1958. So there's almost like a kind of like J.D. Salinger-esque like spurning of kind of public author identity and sort of like her fans and that kind of stuff.
I think that's so interesting because, like, when I think about this text, I think that the big questions it's asking are about identity and your like personal sense of identity and the way that like that is internally processed, but also, kind of only exists in the context of like the social sphere you find yourself in. We have these ideas about ourselves, but we only can process them in relation to other people. And so this kind of becoming a recluse is this rejection of the social sphere of the self in this way that I think the really hard parts of this text, like it makes sense how you kind of get from the hard parts of Nightwood to becoming the Greenwich Village recluse E. Cummings is checking the status of every morning.
Yeah, your E. Cummings check-in. So what should we jump in, or is there anything else we want to talk before?
No, I mean, let's jump right in. I think we've kind of beaten around the bush enough. And like we said, there's no like best way to tackle this text. I think we kind of just got to dive right in. So this is not like a plot book, listeners, but I am going to start off with the opening scene because I really enjoyed the opening of this book. I think it has a lot of resonances aesthetically with other texts we've talked about. So we open with a birth. We open with the birth of he's not the protagonist. He's the protagonist of like the first chapter, I guess. And then he kind of recedes a bit in the text as the story, as it were, goes on. And that is Felix. What's his last name? Volkbein. Felix Volkbein.
Yeah.
So Felix Volkbein is born to his mother, Hedwig Volkbein, and his father, Guido Volkbein. Guido is crucially an Italian Jew who has pretended to be a baron, basically to make himself more interesting and like to increase his like business prospects, kind of by shearing away his Jewish identity. And he's kind of tricked this woman into believing he's a nobleman so that she'll marry him, and they have a son.
Christian too.
Yes,
because by becoming a baron, he will be Christian and not practicing Jewish faith.
Yes. So he marries this woman, Hedwig. They have their son, Felix. They both die. Guido dies before Felix is born, and Hedwig dies very soon afterwards. So Felix is kind of this orphan, but he grows up with this sense of himself as having this baronial title, even though he does not seem to. It is not something that is. He's not accepted into the company of people who have titles and kind of this interwar Europe he finds himself in as a young man.
And he has to kind of invent one. So he gets some fake portraits of his parents. He becomes obsessed with nobility and tradition and history. And a lot of the first chapter is sort of like describing his obsession with this and the need to kind of continue his own line and thus secure like a son. as well. There's sort of like an importance to kind of like keep the Volkbeins going, because they are somewhat related to the Habsburgs, although the connection is a little, I think, tenuous. So
I think within the scope of the text, it's not even tenuous. It's purely fictitious. Yeah. But again, I think here we have something very interesting, because there's obviously some echoes of the Gothic here. We have, again, kind of the decaying noble house. But crucially, it's a farce. The decaying house it's like the mansion in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's this pastiche of the Gothic for the sake of putting on airs to some degree. And what I think is really cool here is this opening, I think, makes it very clear that this text is, at least on some level, supposed to be read as comedic. There's a lot of images in this book that I think read as uncanny and on one way, as comedic in other ways. But I think like the overall tone I got from a lot of criticism of this book is that it's, a lot of people read this as like a straightforwardly like kind of tragic text. And I think that is kind of the wrong way to go about it. I think that Djuna Barnes is being very playful with us from the jump, kind of owing to her modernist sensibilities.
There's a great funny bit too, that he only keeps a cook and I think valet or butler in this fake crumbling mansion because they remind him of famous royal personages. So
the maid looks like Victoria.
Yeah, he's like, Victoria. Like, he only kind of wants to be reminded of these things without, actually experiencing them. And then in this sort of era of fake titles, he falls in with circus people, and circus people also have fake titles. And Anna, you actually had pointed out when he encounters a trapeze artist, there's something going on with the presentation of the trapeze artist that should clue us into there's more going on here than just like, look at this guy who's kind of like obsessed with surface appearances, because he thinks that's how I should act. There's more going on here with that trapeze artist.
Oh, Frau Mann, yes. Which I did not notice until my second read through. There's a line about Frau Mann. But Frau Mann literally translates into like Miss Man. And when describing Frau Mann, they talk about one somehow felt they ran through her as design runs through the hard holiday candies, and the bulge in the groin where she took the bar. 1 foot caught in the flex of the calf was solid, specialized, as polished as oak. Which to me kind of signals that Frau Mann is perhaps doing drag. There's a lot in this novel.
Yeah, doing drag in the context of a circus with an assumed identity as well. And so she meets Felix, who is, again, assumed identity. He falls in with circus people. He likes them a lot more than actual royalty because they all have sort of assumed personages. And there's this kind of like kinship he gets. And I think, John, like in the opening, if it's sort of like a satire of this kind of person, when he starts like getting into the circus, it's still comedic, but suddenly you're like, okay, this is what Felix is actually looking for. Not like kind of decaying nobility, but like kinship with people who kind of create identities out of, for themselves in this kind of like, European period.
Yeah. I mean, crucially, a lot of the people he's interacted with in the circus, they're other kind of social outcasts. I think that the text is a little ambiguous into how much Felix kind of understands his own Jewishness. He clearly still like holds these baronial pretensions that his father claimed to distance himself from his Judaism, but there are other passages where he is very clearly like, he knows he's Jewish. He's kind of partaking in ethnic comedy with a friend of his, where he's making fun of his friend for being Irish, his friend's making fun of him for being Jewish. But the circus folk, again, it's transvestites. There are Black people. There are other like ethnic minorities involved. And so clearly there is this sense that he cannot actually like enter the rarefied spheres of actual nobility. So he kind of has to settle for this, demimonde, this kind of strange other world, this night world, if you will, where he can just slip in and be who he wants to be. in a way that's very cool and very interesting.
Yeah, and also sort of like a little bit after the opening, he like goes to some count's house, and the count isn't there yet, and he walks in, and Dr. Matthew O'Connor is basically just monologuing in front of everyone. I gotta say, Matthew, probably my MVP character, just because he gets the most like outlandish things. But Dr. Matthew O'Connor is sort of like his contact for this night world. And importantly, you know, brushing past Matthew for a second, when the count finally shows up, he just goes, "Get out of here!" Like he's like, "I don't want you guys here." So like everyone there just kind of like ends up at the bar. So like suddenly it's like Frau Mann, Matthew O'Connor, and Felix are all just kind of like hanging out at the bar, basically. And that's like, you know, the real book, you know, starts there, even though the opening is, of course, important. But like, yeah, he basically meets all these interesting nighttime characters, you know, while he's trying to perhaps ingratiate himself with like actual nobility. But as soon as the count shows up at his own party, he's like, just get out of here, scram, basically.
There's like an odd absence in this book. So this is a book kind of about, again, this night world, this underworld where there are gay people and lesbians and transvestites and Jews, all kind of in the backdrop of 1920s Europe, which was this time of very fraught social conditions, and, you know, lead up to fascism. World War II, I think, is very much kind of in this book's DNA. But we don't have a lot of scenes of these characters interacting with kind of authority as we would understand it. Like there's very few scenes of these people. There's very few scenes that take place during the day when people like the Count would probably be more active and empowered to do what they want. There aren't a lot of scenes of people kind of involved with the police or with other functionaries of the state. There's kind of a lack of this patriarchal or like heterosexual or Christian state authority that really intrude on this demimon that we're viewing right now. And I think the Count is one kind of showing up and kicking everyone out of the party is really one of the only times that happens. And it kind of ends up being a good thing.
Yeah, because then the characters get together. Also, I think the only time I can think of is when I guess we should say Nora Flood, who is the Djuna Barnes stand-in, is telling Matthew about the time Robin Vogt, who was at the Thelma Wood stand-in, got so drunk that the cops had to show up. And even then, they're kind of like a minor, you know, appearance. So along those lines, it's through Matthew that Felix meets Robin Vogt, who is his sort of like, here's the woman that I will marry and continue my line with. And Robin Vogt's character introduction is really interesting because she's like she like faints, and like the doctor is called, and she's like lying sort of supine on like a couch with all of these like plants around her. Is sort of what happens. And like the language gets almost like, it reminds me of those like portraits of Ophelia by like the I guess it'd be the Romantics, kind of like a lot of naturalist imagery, and she's sort of like lying supine, and like Felix is like immediately smitten by her, and he's like, I want to meet this woman, and Matthew is there. There's a great bit where Matthew he's a doctor, so he's called to sort of resuscitate her, and after he resuscitates her, he immediately like pockets 100 franc note that somebody left on the table in what is described as like the hands of a conjurer, where like everyone's looking at him doing something else, and he slips like $1 in his pocket. Or I guess it's more than $1. And then Felix sees that and is like, okay, I'm forever bound to this man. like I will take care of my degenerate doctor friend who steals from people he's supposed to be protecting. So
well, funnier than that, he also like puts on her perfume and puts on like lipstick, and Felix is just like, oh God, but also like, I can never leave this man. Like we're bound in this together now.
Well, yeah, we should mention about Matthew O'Connor. Just briefly, Matthew O'Connor is a gynecologist and also, you know, a doctor as well. But also Matthew expresses at one point that he should have been born a woman. And that's sort of like his preoccupation with identity, is that he cannot exist the way that he would like to exist.
Yes. I feel like we're going to get to him a little bit more. We're still kind of in the first, or we're in the second chapter right now, I think. We're going to get a little bit later to his kind of sermonizing moment, and that's what I think we'll really kind of get into. Yeah, the sticky question of his identity. But if you guys don't object, I'd really like to read the passage where we first meet Robin, because I think that it shows off what an amazing prose stylist Djuna Barnes is, and I think that there's a lot kind of to unpack here about like the way this text like is looking at gender and art and a lot of other things. So, on a bed, surrounded by a confusion of potted plants, exotic palms, and cut flowers, faintly oversung by the notes of unseen birds, which seem to have been forgotten, left without the usual silencing cover, which, like cloaks on funeral urns, are cast over their cages at night by good housewives. Half flung off the support of the cushions from which, in a moment of threatened consciousness, she had turned her head, lay the young woman, heavy and disheveled. Her legs, in white flannel trousers, were spread as in a dance, the thick, lacquered pumps looking too lively for the arrested step. Her hands, long and beautiful, lay on either side of her face. The perfume of her body exhaled was of the quality of that earth flesh, fungi, which smells of captured dampness and yet is so dry, overcast with the odor of oil of amber, which is an inner malady of the sea, making her seem as if she had invaded a sleep incautious and entire. Her flesh was the texture of plant life, and beneath it one sensed a frame, broad, porous, and sleep-worn, as if sleep were a decay fishing her beneath the visible surface. About her head there was an effulgence as of phosphorus glowing about the circumference of a body of water, as if her life lay through her in ungainly, luminous deteriorations. The troubling structure of the born somnambule, who lives in two worlds, meet of child and desperado. Like a painting by that Dunier Rousseau, she seemed to lie in a jungle trapped in a drawing room, in the apprehension of which the walls had made their escape, thrown in among the carnivorous flowers as their ration, set the property of an unseen dompteur, half lord, half promoter, over which one expects to hear the strains of an orchestra of woodwind render a serenade which will popularize the wilderness.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, again, I think this gets into what I like about the modernists in general, but I think Djuna Barnes in particular. I'm, as a writer, I've always been one of those people. I love my enjambments. I love just sticking as many phrases in between my, like the important bits of my sentences as possible. It's a reason why I've never been able to kind of get on with the MFA set. And I think Djuna Barnes does that better than anybody else can. Most of those paragraphs are like one sentence, but they all just have so many like beautifully descriptive and like evocative phrases just kind of thrown in between semicolons or commas or M dashes. Who doesn't love a good M dash?
Yeah, to me, reading it is like, you know, there's that old line about cubism and seeing different sides of some perspective, but you get so much like sensory, notional, poetic detail that like you're almost just like overwhelmed. And like even in that, like you can almost see all of the themes of the book. Like she's both asleep and awake. The interior of the house is a jungle, so there's like sort of like a decadent kind of Art Nouveau image that's put there. Like there's some animalness versus like, you know, mankind. Like there's everything's just like jammed into those three paragraphs, and it's almost like overwhelming. Like there's just so much like going on that you're just kind of like taken aback. Like you're just like borne away by it.
Yeah, I read a really cool essay, and I don't have it pulled up in front of me, so it'll be in the show notes, folks. That looked at this as like an ekphrastic text, and Ben, I know you and I have talked a lot about ekphrasis in like our personal conversations, and I think that's so cool. Like she's basically being described like Keats's like Grecian urn.
Yeah,
like the imagery is just spilling out like beyond what you could even show in a painting or in a photograph of this person if they did exist, just by the power of the language here. And I think it really just shows what an amazing talent Djuna Barnes is as a stylist.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot talks about that a little bit in his introduction, where he talks about how beautiful the writing is and how it's not just prose, but also poetry. And it makes me think of the first time I read this book, where I'm not one to read more than 100 pages a day typically, but I think I like stopped breathing and just read the whole thing through. And I was just completely enamored by the writing.
Well, what's great about it too is like, I feel like it's also easy to read this all in one sitting because the characters are often given like a lot of space to talk. So you sort of like, you just get like one set of characters, like one person talks. And while that can seem like monotonous, it's just, she's so good that it's like totally fine if a character is like talking, because you're getting like uncut Djuna Barnes prose for like, 150 pages.
I also feel like there's an interesting level where like so much of this text is dialogue, at least in certain chapters. And I feel like this book has reminded me a lot. It's drawn up a lot of memories of Crocodile. And I feel like we said something a little bit similar in our review of that book. Kind of utilizing dialogue kind of lets you, I think, be even more indulgent with your prose sometimes, because you can put it in the mouth of a person, so it doesn't feel like you're, as the author, being you're not being excessive, you're not being overly ornamental. It's the character who is doing those things. Like, I think the Dr. O'Connor monologue, I guess we'd say, we're going to get to here in a little bit, really would not work the same way if it was not like kind of being spoken by this character. And I think that Djuna Barnes is very smart about how she uses dialogue in this.
No, I was thinking about this time in this book, how nothing ever actually happens, but everybody talks about what happens. You very rarely see anything happening in real time. Yeah. And I think the Dr. O'Connor monologues work because it's almost like Barnes can sense you stopping, like starting to get a little bit bored with it. And O'Connor will literally call you out and be like, hold on 1 second, like, hold on, I'm almost to the point. And then he'll just go on for more pages.
Or he'll say something like, that reminds me of Tiny O'Caffrey, and you're like, what? he'll refer to like things or people that aren't clearly explained also, which is like really fun. To me, it makes him feel like more of a real person, where he makes like some reference to something that he just doesn't explain. And like, you can look it up if you want, but like, he's just so like, he's like, mile a minute.
All right. Do we have any more we want to say kind of about the prose or about this scene with Robin?
I do have one other prose example I just want to share. It's a little bit smaller. This is from that same chapter when Felix is realizing the importance of Matthew to him. As the altar of a church would present but a barren stylization, but for the uncalculated offerings of the confused and humble, as the corsage of a woman is made suddenly martial and sorrowful by the is made suddenly marital and sorrowful by the rose thrust among the more decorous blooms, by the hand of a lover suffering the violence of the overlapping of the permission to bestow a last embrace and its withdrawal, making a vanishing and infinitesimal bullseye out of that had a moment before been a buoyant and showy bosom, by drawing time out of his bowels, for a lover knows 2 times that which he is given and that which he must take. So Felix was astonished to find that the most touching flowers laid on the altar he had raised to his imagination were placed there by the people of the underworld, and that the reddest was to be the rose of the doctor. the fact that she goes back to the corsage image at the end just blows me away. Like there's like that huge opening, and then it's like, and it was just a rose that I am giving the doctor, and I'm saying you're gonna be my person. Like, it just opens and closes so nicely. It's great.
One thing I will also say that I find interesting, Ben, you and I just both read a passage, and they weren't short passages either, and we really did not like miss a beat. I'm not trying to brag, dear listener, but in the past when Ben and I have tried to do have read passages from the text we've talked about, a lot of times we've kind of had to do like a take or two to get it right, or we just kind of lose ourselves in the passage and have to kind of cut it back together. Open kimono here. But in this case, for both of those passages, we did not. And I think that, again, that just really shows like how strong this prose is. Like the fact that it just carries you through like that, and you're not getting lost despite how complex these sentences are. And again, the different levels they're working on. I think, it really speaks to the quality of the writing here.
So I guess we should move on to what happens to Felix. So Felix attempts to woo Robin Vogt, and she sort of accepts it, and he's trying to kind of show her his respect and reverence for tradition, and she bears him a child, and she realizes that she does not want this child, and she does not want to be in this relationship. And this is the chapter, it's called The Sleepwalker, La Somnambule, which she was a reference to in that thing John read. And it's kind of tragic because like at one point, like Felix is like, I don't know what's going wrong. And then later he's like, oh, I've been deceiving her the whole time. And she's sort of refusing to accept this, basically we would say like position that sort of society has said like you should have. And she rejects it.
Yeah, she almost murders their child.
Yeah, she's holding the child really up high in the air and then brings the kid down.
Yeah, and so she basically exits and leaves Felix with this child, who we'll see a little bit more later in the book. And Robin flees to America, which is where the next relationship in her life starts up. So this brings us to chapter 3, which focuses on her relationship with Nora. So Ben, I know you said earlier, Nora is our Djuna Barnes kind of stand-in, whereas Robin is the Thelma stand-in. So Nora, does anyone want to talk about Nora as a character?
I guess I will say that with Nora, it's interesting because, you know, she's presented kind of as also being an American who runs a salon where various people talk. And she's kind of like in the center of it. But, you know, it says that she hadn't really quite like given herself to some person. There's bits about how like she's sort of, you know, been in relationships with people, but she hasn't quite like given herself in a romantic relationship until she meets Robin. And with Nora, I feel like, I could be wrong, but I feel like with Nora, it's almost like Nora is kind of like our witness as to what happens. Like we don't get a whole lot about Nora as opposed to like we get stuff from her perspective, but like when things go wrong with Robin, she goes to visit the doctor, and a lot of that is just the doctor talking. So like Nora is kind of like our stand-in, but Nora doesn't like ever quite take center stage, I feel like, as much as the other characters.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that if she's the Djuna Barnes stand-in, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Like she's not like, you know, record scratch. You're probably wondering how I end up here. It's like, you know, Nora is kind of introduced and then like is in a relationship with Robin, and we get them together more than we get Nora on her own. And then afterwards, when they break up, Nora goes to talk to the doctor about what happened. Although the Night Watch chapter does have the most Nora because it is kind of her perspective on the relationship with Robin.
Yeah. I think she seems like she's in the background, but she really comes back around at the end with the Go Down Matthew chapter. But she does stay in the background quite a bit until that end point, where you're always kind of thinking of her, but not actually.
And in their relationship with Robin, there's a lot of attention paid to how they decorate the house. They talk about the house as sort of like a museum to their relationship. I believe does Robin give her a doll, or am I thinking of later?
Robin gives her a doll. And then it shows back up later, yeah.
Yeah, so and the doll is kind of like the child that they can't have, and the child sort of like representative of the life they have together that is not actually having a kid, which Robin did have but didn't want. So this is sort of like kind of, I would say, fraught image of kind of like, yeah, like sterility, relationships, not procreating, their life together. And the relationship ends up souring because basically, as Anna had said, Thelma, who's Robin, wanted the world and Nora, and, you know, Nora, who is Djuna, just wanted her. And so she goes out to bars, she starts seeking the attention of other people, and this obviously upsets Nora, and that kind of precipitates the relationship ending.
Yeah. You know, I'd say if there's like a tragic chapter in this book, I feel like this is the tragic chapter. Again, I got a lot of echoes of Chu Miao Jian in this chapter in terms of again the struggling with like how do you live as like a queer person in a society where it's like the purpose of relationships is social reproduction and you can't do that, and how do you make sense of your life in that context? And people respond to that in different ways. Robin responds to it through this promiscuity, whereas Nora is trying to kind of, I don't know if she's trying to necessarily fully imitate like the norms of like heterosexual monogamy, but she does want a monogamous relationship. She wants Nora and she wants Robin and her to be enough for each other, even without this child that can, that at least in kind of the idealized image of a heterosexual relationship would be the culmination and the purpose of the relationship.
Yes. And I think that goes back to the doll, because the doll is kind of a symbol for a child. I think the book, I believe somebody says that outright at some point. But it's very interesting because if you go back to when Robin was with Felix, she would hold the child up and like at the last minute not dash the child down. But she does end up near the end of the relationship holding that doll up and just smashing it on the ground and saying like it's over. But I did want to loop back very quickly to Nora Flood's very first line in this book, which I think is just the funniest line in this book, where, to set the scene, they are at the Count's house and Matthew O'Connor and Felix are talking and going on their big, long rant about the church and making fun of being Irish versus Jewish. And at some point she comes in and she just says, "Are you both really saying what you mean, or are you just talking?" Which I think is the funniest and best first line. And it's very fun to think about as you read more of the book and you get into more of the monologues.
Yeah, because like that's like the sort of like the straight man coming in and being like, "Would you stop joking?" like it's like stop doing your respective bits, because like Felix and Matthew are just doing bits at each other, and she's just like, "Do you actually mean this?" So.
Do we have any more we want to say about this? I feel like I like this chapter a lot, but I feel like a lot of the content here kind of gets colored in more and more by the rest of the book. I'd say this is kind of the chapter where the action is, so to speak. And then the rest of the book is really dealing with the fallout of this chapter. But
the last thing I will say is that there's sort of like a doomed funeral air to this chapter, because they're like, oh, this is going to be the relationship. And it's like, it was over before it started. It's like the feeling you get basically like when you're reading it. And it's sort of like it's sort of like, it's very like doomed and fatalistic.
Yeah. I believe like at the very beginning of the chapter, there's the line, Nora had the face of all people who love the people, a face that would be evil when she found out that to love without criticism is to be betrayed. So it's like immediately it's just like, this is bad. This is not going to end well.
Right. So that brings us to the fourth and shortest chapter in the book, which is The Squatter, which is about a character I think we've referenced already, Ms. Jenny Petherbridge, who Djuna Barnes is clearly not a fan of whoever this is based on.
Barnes gives everybody a little bit of leeway except for Jenny Petherbridge.
So Jenny is this very strange woman who basically the whole of chapter 4 is just kind of dedicated to describing her and kind of a little bit of kind of how she enters into the lives of these other characters. So she is a widow, a middle-aged woman who's been married 4 times, each of her husbands having wasted away and died, presumably from having to deal with her all the time.
4 husbands. Yeah, so.
She's got this very odd physicality to it. Again, this kind of almost ekphrastic description where she looks old yet expectant of age. She seemed to be steaming in the vapors of someone else about to die. Still, she gave off an odor to the mind, for they're purely mental smells that have no reality, of a woman about to be accouchée, which means going to the birthing bed. So she's this very strange woman. She's like somehow old and young at the same time, like sterile and pregnant. She gives off this weird mental smell. She
she steals. She's a robber also. Yeah.
It says she like lives basically surrounded by other people's things that she's either borrowed or have just kind of ended up in her possession, other people's books, other people's things. The only things that she seems to kind of like are tiny ivory and jade elephants, which she thinks are like good luck. And it says that she kind of tiptoes around her own house because she feels like she's basically just surrounded by other people's things and she can't risk like damaging them.
Yeah, I love this line. When anyone was witty about a contemporary event, she would look perplexed and a little dismayed, as if someone had done something they really should not have been done. Therefore, her attention had been narrowed down to listening for faux pas. So, like, yeah, so she's just sort of like, did somebody say something they shouldn't have said? Like, she's just doing that the whole time and, like, not kind of actually trying to be, witty or interesting.
I think what's very funny about, again, this description of her is that I think out of everything Djuna Barnes hates this character for, it's the fact that she's a poser. A lot of A is made of the fact that she gives off the appearance of being well-read, but doesn't read very much. And so she kind of somehow ends up becoming kind of a hanger-on to this kind of circus world. And she ends up meeting the characters, the kind of rest of the cast at the opera. And somehow her and Robin kind of end up together, which drives Nora crazy. It says, when she fell in love, it was with a perfect fury of accumulated dishonesty. She became instantly a dealer in secondhand and therefore incalculable emotions. As from the solid archives of usage, she had stolen or appropriated the dignity of speech. So she appropriated the most passionate love that she knew. Nora's for Robin. She was a squatter by instinct.
So I have a question. I don't kind of know the answer, but why do we think Robin left Nora for Squatter? Do we have an answer for that? Because, like, again, it should be like Nora actually loves her and Jenny is just like this ridiculous woman. But why do we think Robin left?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I feel like we get more of Nora's psychology than we do of Robin's. Robin is really kind of this cipher through a lot of the novel. She's constantly having other people's desires projected onto her first. First Felix's and then Nora's. I wonder if with Jenny it is kind of this thing where Jenny is someone who like cannot help but be an orbiter. She does not she has like an even weaker sense of self than Robin has. And so I don't know if there's kind of this idea that she can, like, if Robin is the one who Robin's like more in control somehow, or I wonder if it's just out of this like perverse desire to hurt other people by choosing this person who sucks and who is so clearly, like, again, from the standpoint of like Djuna Barnes clearly doesn't like this character, Nora clearly doesn't like this character. Like the fact that the people who we're kind of supposed to think are like cool in this book, like clearly hate this woman and like wish that she wasn't like hanging around their cafes and opera shows. Like I wonder if it's just this kind of perverse desire to just kind of lash out in a weird way and kind of just be like, no, I'm not what you people think I am.
Yeah, and I think that jives with what you said about like sort of people projecting their desires onto Robin, and then Robin's like, yeah, I don't want to do that anymore, basically. So also I will say, if, as Anna said, the squatter is an heiress, that's just another reason why rich people suck. So you just bought your way into this cool club and you can't even hang, basically. So,
well, it's something we haven't. I just thought of something as well, Ben. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that was the end of my thought. Rich people suck.
Yeah. So we haven't referenced it yet, but something that they make about Robin. So we haven't really given, like, there was a physical description of her in that first passage, but kind of later in that same chapter, they kind of describe her physical appearance a little more. And she's described as, I guess we would say like today, like she's kind of masked. She's not butch, but she definitely kind of looks like a boy a little bit.
Yeah.
Is the implication. And I think that there's clearly this element of her where she's trying to reject what a woman is kind of supposed to look like, but in a weird way that makes her more desirable to the certain class of people, which again then leads into, like we were saying, the projection of desire onto her and the trying to make her into this perfect image of what they want her to be. And I think she just kind of has this fundamental like contrariness in her character that she's going to express one way or the other. And I think dating Jenny Petherbridge is part of that perversity.
Yeah, they do. I do want to get around to like some of the gender ambiguity of this book, but yes, like pretty much any time to describe Robin, she does make a point to be like, she looks a little bit boyish, and she's often wearing trousers.
Yeah.
I think on my first read of this, although I'm less sure of this now, I feel like her staying with Jenny was because I think she just wants to inflict the most pain she could. And Jenny is very insecure in that relationship.
Yeah.
Like, it drives Jenny insane to watch her being promiscuous and flirting around. There's the carriage scene in this chapter where she's there with the English girl and she's like flirting with the English girl right in front of Jenny, and Jenny's like having a breakdown about it.
Yeah, what did we think that, like, so that chapter ends with Jenny attacking Robin, and then the child is like, let me out of this carriage. And then later when Matthew tells it, Matthew screams, which I think is kind of like a funny, like, I don't know whose account is the real one, but we get two accounts, like one of the kids screaming and then one of Matthew screaming, like at witnessing what happens.
Yeah, and the kid is interesting because in each relationship so far, like, she has the son with Felix. She doesn't want the son. She has the doll, which does end up in Jenny Partridge's house, by the way. Jenny Partridge has both the doll and a picture of, I think, both Nora and Robin, or one that Robin took for Nora. So she comes upon these items, but the child, the niece, her name is Sylvia, I think, becomes the next thing, like the next child for Robin to try to take care of. And the child is absolutely enamored with Robin in the beginning, and Robin is absolutely enamored with the child. But I don't know if we want to get to it yet, but that does not last. And so I think it's interesting how each relationship that Robin enters in, somebody tries to put in a stand-in for a child.
Yeah, I think that, again, there's this element where, again, the relationships have this social function, and for most of society that is understood to be like procreation, having children. And so even if people are doing it consciously, like, they're always putting Robin in this position of, no, you need to be a mother, like that's what you're supposed to do. Even again in these ostensibly lesbian relationships, there's still this desire to replicate social reproduction. And Robin, because she is like kind of fundamentally I gotta find a different word for it, but perverse. Like she just wants the opposite of what she's told. I think she rejects it every time, often violently.
Yeah, and it's also too like that child is almost like the symbol of their relationship, and it happens to be like the hetero social reproduction one. But it's like it's almost like there needs to be something that was like proof of our relationship.
Yeah.
Whether it's a real child or a doll, or just a kid from somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think we talk about this later in the book, but I think the thing about Robin is that she wants to be missed. And I think because Jenny is so clear about being so jealous and stuff, like she wants to do her own thing, but she wants somebody to not want her to do it. I feel like that's part of her motivation in life.
Yeah, she's contrary.
Yeah,
because Nora misses her, which I guess we can go to the first. Well, I guess I feel like the Doctor gets two monologues, but the first one is the biggest one. So Nora is distraught and goes to find the Doctor, and she doesn't really tell the Doctor she's coming, and she goes in like the middle of the night, and the Doctor lets her in, and the Doctor is described as expecting someone else and is basically dressed as a woman. He's described as wearing his gown. Is one of the lines.
He's wearing a wig and a nightgown, and it's very interesting. There are allusions to Little Red Riding Hood. Basically, the doctor, like when he sees that it's Nora and not whoever he was actually expecting, he like gets in bed and like pulls the covers up so that he's concealing as much of like his body as he can. I assume he's still wearing the wig, so I'm sure he still looks ridiculous. But even Nora's like, oh, this is the big bad wolf. Like,
well, she even says children know something that they can't say. They prefer both Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf in the same bed. So like there's like a kind of like, yeah, like a fusion of the two.
No, there's just another comical moment in there where he is wearing the wig, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, he just like rips it off and just throws it, and Nora just pretends not to see him.
Yeah, that line when he goes, "You see, you can ask me about anything," is I think my favorite line in the novel, because it's like this complete like this is who I am kind of like in a novel about like putting on appearances and identities and stuff. It's like totally unguarded, and that was like that's when I knew this book was amazing. Like I've been enjoying it, but like that particular exchange really sealed the deal for me.
I think there's also kind of like a secret agent kind of element to it, where it's like, okay, you know my secret identity, so if you tell me any secret, you know I can't rat you out because you can tell anyone. Like it's mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
You can tell me, but you'll have to kill me.
Yeah.
But this is my favorite part of the book. I don't know about you guys. Like you said, Ben, Matthew, Mighty Grain of Salt, Dante O'Connor, all-time MVP character in the Infinite Library Hall of Fame, raises women's size jersey to the rafters.
Yeah. Maybe we all monologue as well as he can.
Oh my god!
But I wanted to I wanted to bring something up here that I did not think about when I was reading this scene. I read a really, really cool essay as I was prepping for this one. It's called "Laughing at Leviticus." It's by a scholar of modernism by the name of Jane Marcus, who, from what I gather, is a pretty big deal in kind of like feminist readings of modernist literature kind of circles. But she points out that this is a parody of like Freudian psychoanalysis. So we have the patient coming to the doctor, but everything's everything's topsy-turvy. The patient is kind of the one who's a little cagey and doesn't want to talk. The doctor is their psychological hangups are just on full display for everyone to see. They're the one talking the whole time, you know, kind of classic Freudian psychoanalysis. It's the patient talking while, you know, Dr. Freud is sitting there silently, just, you know, asking the occasional question, just taking copious notes. And so it's this inversion of the psychoanalytic scene, and that really kind of opened the scene up even more for me.
Yeah.
And again, I think that this is another scene where, when I first read it, like there's obviously comedic elements here. The doctor being a cross-dresser is very silly on one level, but there's another reading where it's very tragic. He's this person who, again, can't quite seem to make sense of his identity. But again, then I read it again through this lens, and there is still that tragic element there, but it becomes, for me, so much more comedic. It's so much more ridiculous that this is what's going on. That
he also starts like talking about how like the French people know how to incorporate their sins into their lifestyle, and like he's like, we should all be like the French or something like and he starts like doing like cultural analysis as well, like while he's also revealing his like psychological hangups and stuff like that.
So Nora comes to the doctor. She's looking for advice on how to handle her emotional turmoil over this breakup, and the doctor just goes on a tear. This monologue is all over the place. Again, it's one of those things, I don't even know where to start with it. There's so much here. There's, you know, he's dissecting, like you said, Ben, cultural norms and lesbian relationships, and there's I noticed some really interesting stuff about religion in this dialogue. There's definitely some kind of references to reincarnation, I think I noticed here.
He also talks about cruising too.
Cruising?
Like Yeah, he talks about like picking people up in bathrooms and stuff like so. Like, yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah. I don't know where to start with this. Where do you guys want to start talking about this?
I mean, every time that O'Connor talks, there's a lot. There's a lot to try to digest, and it just goes. I think one of the funny things about the Doctor, though, is he really doesn't want to hear any of this. And so his monologues, I think, go so off the rails because he doesn't want to hear any of this from anyone.
Yeah, he's clearly like annoyed that Nora's there, and the monologue
he was expecting somebody. Yeah.
He was expecting someone.
It's like 3 a.m. He's presumably waiting on gentleman caller. And this woman shows up to complain about her relationship problems to her, and we've all been there, Doctor. I've been there. That's all I'll say.
I do want to point out something because there is he refers to himself as a bearded lady at one point. So it goes back to like the carnival imagery. I do want to note that he does spend a lot of time talking about like what the night means, which I think is like kind of too big of a subject to try to pin down for this book. But I do want to note there's a particularly great line where he talks about, our bones ache only while the flesh is on them. Stretch it as thin as the temple flesh of an ailing woman, and still it serves to ache the bone and to move the bone about. And in like manner, the night is the skin pulled over the head of day, that the day may be in torment. And I think like with that, you get a kind of like biblical imagery, but also like the importance of like the unconscious or like the other or like the thing that can't be explained by, hetero Christian rationality. Like there's the Doctor is kind of speaking up for that in this as a way to kind of talk to Nora. Although I feel like later he gives Nora more concrete advice. I think this time he's literally just riffing about like stuff that's obviously important to the book, but he doesn't sort of directly tell Nora like what to do.
Yeah, he's definitely riffing in this one. I think it's also when he talks about the night, when he's talking about like the French versus other people, he talks about like, because when you wake up in the morning and you try to wash off the night from you, you're making it worse for yourself. Like you have to own up to the actions that you do in the night, and if you don't, you'll be miserable. And I thought that was also interesting.
Yeah, so I feel like this is kind of probably the section where the meat of the rest of our conversation is going to go. So I feel like, again, let's quit beating around the bush and let's really dig into some stuff here. So
yeah.
Ben, I know you want to talk a little bit about the Doctor as like a trans character, and I also wanted to talk about that because, again, I think that it's a fascinating element here. There have been kind of these weird hints earlier in the book, like again when they find Robin in the first chapter, and he literally like steals her cosmetics. We kind of know there's something a little like iffy with this guy before we even get to this point, and then we walk in. He's dressed as a woman. He's cross-dressing, presumably for sexual reasons. And as the monologue goes on, he says some really odd things. Trying to find a specific passage here.
I will also say too, like as Anna pointed out, when he says like it's important to integrate your night, like your maybe I don't know, not respectable or unconscious or hidden desires into your daily life. He almost can't do that, which is like kind of what, as you were saying, John, makes the scene like so tragic and comic because he's trying to tell Nora something that he can't do.
Yeah.
And like like he wants to have been a woman. He thinks he was born a woman. He says like, how come, whenever I hear music, I think I'm a bride. And so like, there's like this, I don't know, like he's trying to give Nora something that he can't have. As you were saying, when he's just waiting for somebody to show up, like this is the most ill-opportune time to give this monologue, and yet he's kind of doing it anyway. In like that essay sounds cool, and like the inversion of the Freudian psychoanalysis.
I like that. I like the idea that he and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit again back with Tears of a Crocodile. Like the language isn't there for him to like fully describe his experience. I don't know if the term lesbian was current yet. I kind of have to assume it was because Djuna Barnes said she wasn't a lesbian, but I don't know when she was being asked about that, so I can't say for sure. But there's definitely this element in this book where it's like no one quite knows what to do with all these feelings they're having.
Yeah.
The doctor, feels like he was born a woman. The Nora and Robin have this relationship, and even though, again, like the threat in the book is not the idea that like, oh, the cops are going to break their door down and like forcibly separate them and like send them to an asylum or something. That's something that maybe happens a little later in history with, stuff in the 50s and the way that the Red Scare and anti-LGBT stuff got tied up together. But there is still this idea that it's like these people can't, there's no place for them in society. And this kind of night world that they've managed to find, it's still like, okay. It's so interesting. Again, I'm going in circles here, but Ben, what you were saying about how the doctor can't do that, none of these characters can. None of these characters have day lives. They all just exist at night. They're all night people. And there is no way for them to kind of do the Jungian like self-actualization because society won't let them. Even if their psychologies would, which I think the text is pretty ambiguous about whether or not what the doctor is saying here is even possible.
Like as in terms of like integrating your night with your day.
Yeah, I mean,
like
I think
for him
I think there's a question there. I think that there is this element where I think even today, I think that even though obviously, LGBT stuff is much more accepted, we have all this language. I think that there are still a lot of debates about whether or not assimilation into kind of like normal society is possible or desirable for queer people. And I don't know how to talk about this without just going down a rabbit hole that would be here all night, but this is just a book that God.
Yeah.
I feel like we just keep coming up with this interesting stuff and we just are like, it's too big. We can't break it down.
Well, and too, like I mean, he talks about Jenny. He talks about being the bearded lady.
Yeah. Right under that bearded lady, I think, is one of the quotes that's very oof in this book. Which we can circle right back around to O'Connor because he's so interesting. But again, just kind of the premonition of it. It was more than a boy like me, who am the last woman left in this world, though I am the bearded lady, could bear, and I went into a lather of misery watching them and thinking of you and how in the end you'll all be locked together like poor beasts that get their antlers mixed and are found dead that way, their heads fattened with the knowledge of each other they never wanted, having to contemplate each other head on and eye to eye until death. Which is the part where he's confessing to her that he introduced Robin and Jenny together.
And so he's also confessing too. So like again,
yes,
the parody,
the
parody of the psychoanalysis, or it's like the guy who's supposed to fix your problems is like, actually, I made things worse for you. So.
I believe this is also the chapter where he talks about wanting, like, in death to crawl back into his mother's womb, which is a lot to unpack, but it was one of the most interesting, if you want to talk about flipping Freudian stuff on its head.
Yeah. No, I'm coming back to sort of the idea of like, what's this text's like actual viewpoint? And I really keep finding myself wondering, like, does Djuna Barnes like think that there is a way to integrate this stuff? I'm thinking about now kind of the Freudianism kind of relies on this idea that not necessarily that the human being is perfectible, but that you can take someone who's suffering, neuroticism, which we can say is what Nora and the doctor are suffering from in this scene, and get them.
They also call it like neurasthenia. I think neurasthenia, and like Felix is like, you might have neurasthenia, And he's like, no, I don't really care about other people, which is the true basis for this. And neurasthenia was like the catch-all diagnosis at the time that would have fit neuroticism or anything else. So yeah.
But there's this idea that you can take that person, and through psychoanalysis, you can get them to a point not where they're perfect, but where they're capable of the term that's used is living a life of ordinary unhappiness rather than extraordinary unhappiness, which is what they're currently dealing with.
Yeah.
And again, I feel like this text is very skeptical of that idea. Like, it's never fully brought up, but there's never this idea that like Felix and Robin could ever have made their relationship work.
Right.
There's something, or if it did, if there was a way for it to work, it would require like a fundamental like castration of their, like one of their like selves. Like Robin would have to have like, she would have like had to have had like a lobotomy or something. or Felix would have had to become a different person. Yeah. And so I feel like the night self, there is this element where I think, I don't want to go too far here because I don't feel like I know enough about like Jungian psychoanalysis or even Freudianism to some degree. Like, I feel like it's the night, it's the shadow self, it's the unconscious, it's the part of you that you kind of can't even really wrap your head around like why you feel this way. Like, clearly the night self has a lot to do with like fetishism and I mean that like in the literal like sexual sense. Like, the doctor has like a cross-dressing fetish, and he expresses it in these very like high-minded ways, in terms of, like, he feels like he was like a woman in a past life or something like that. But there is like an element where he sexually enjoys this, maybe. But like, he can't explain why. Like, he doesn't have like a perfect, kind of typical Freudian story. Like, oh, I'm this way because my father was weak and my mother was the strong one in the relationship. And so I identify with women more strongly than men, or something like that. Again, I don't want to overstate my knowledge of Freud here, but I feel like he can't even give an accurate accounting of like why he's like this. Nora can't give an accurate accounting of why she's like this. I don't think Robin could give an accurate accounting of why she's like this. And I don't know that psychoanalysis can necessarily excavate these parts of ourselves in the way that maybe not even psychoanalysis now, but kind of modern psychology would say that it can.
And I think, John, that also aligns a little bit with the book, because I feel like the book is a lot about how it is funny, but also like, nobody gets a happy ending. We don't have to talk about the ending now. Like, it's kind of like a tragic story. And like, when later the doctor comes back to talk to Nora in the chapter Go Down Matthew, and he's basically like telling Nora, like, look, get over yourself. Like, he's like you're into your suffering a little too much, and you should just kind of like deal with it. And I think there are some interpretations of that scene where the doctor is actually advocating for like becoming Christian, where you can subsume your individual problems into like this grander thing. And I don't think that's the whole story. That's just one kind of reading of it. But there's sort of like an injunction to like, to just be ordinarily unhappy. like don't get too much into your unhappiness so that like it's like your sole reason for existing. And so I think there's kind of like the doctor kind of screams at Nora about that, which Anna, we've all talked about. Like, he's finally just like, just stop, like, get over yourself. Like, after like eventually just like dealing with it for a while. So
yeah, I think it's interesting. I don't know if we want to get into it, but it's interesting how each of the characters at Crisis will try to turn to the Catholic Church at each crisis.
Right, which like that's where you get some interesting interpretations of like where this book is sort of involved with like politics of the time. And like, because I was reading a book that was mentioning how like there used to be this the dandy to trad pipeline where you were like a decadent dandy, and then you would go, actually Catholicism is a lot better, and they were sort of aligning that and sort of this mood to do that in this book, but like and that is offered as one solution, but yeah, it's I don't know if it's the solution, but it's definitely something that's there.
Or if if it's a effective solution, because crucially none of the characters actually seem to find any peace
No.
in the church. It
Right.
again, I feel like we beat up on tradcats a lot on the show, but I feel like there is something similar going on today where people are trying to grapple with their existential angst by turning to the Catholic Church, and then they're just doing it for aesthetic purposes, which I guess is a far longer tradition than we realize, which, hey, another theme of the show.
Well, and even too, the like, yeah, I mean, the sort of decadent, 20s kind of vibe, and then suddenly it like there's a pivot. So
Yeah. Do we want to take a minute, on that? I feel like we've kind of come up to a good point to talk about like the politics of the text. Do we want to get into that? Is there a way we can kind of dovetail that into the next chapter or two?
Yeah, I do have a spiel to say on it. I am, Nightwood came out in 1936, and I think it, I think it's impossible to kind of disconnect it from what was going on at the time. And there are some interpretations of like Nightwood's kind of engagement with, we might say, like sort of fascist ideas at the time. And I'm not saying this is a fascist text, and I'm not saying she meant to satirize fascism. But there's an engagement with the idea of like sort of getting really into racial differences, getting really into overcoming universal suffering through some greater cause, as well as sort of like beauty is like this higher ideal. And obviously she's not into this. And I would say she's an anti-fascist writer. And, in her later work, she explicitly addresses like the reasons for doing that. But like at one point, the doctor's like, I might get really obsessed with Germany. You don't know. like he's like imagining like this horrible future for himself where he becomes like sort of like a neo-fascist, like German obsessive. And so like there's this kind of like fraught period of like these discourses of like beauty, of getting rid of your individual suffering through a greater cause, and for kind of like racializing differences that are there, but they're obviously not explaining the whole thing. And I think that's what makes this book so interesting is like there's a clear kind of like engagement with the political ideas of the time, although it's also about a lot of other stuff, as we've already been talking for a while. And I just kind of wanted to point that out because I think that's like also something that I really like this book, that it's kind of like attempting to address some of that, but not in like, a really like overt way, I guess.
No, I agree with you. I think, like I said, the fact that the day world, so to speak, which I think in kind of the metaphors this book is working, like that's the fascist world. Like that's the world where at this point in time, like, the National Socialist Party is forming in Germany. And I'm a Wagner fan, but this book is not nice to my fellow Wagner fans. But, there's a lot about kind of how people who like Wagner are repressing their sexuality, and how the characters don't have a lot of time for Wagner. And I think even in his "What If I Became a Germanaboo" bit of his monologue, the doctor even mentions how he'd start listening to Wagner more.
Well, they don't have time for Wagner because they're embroiled in all of these like relationships. It's like I can't go attend a 24-hour opera and have meaningful thoughts about it. I have to deal with all of my personal problems.
But again, in terms of kind of that core dichotomy, like again, there is so little in this book where, again, I think that if this was I guess you would say like almost like a more of a social novel, I guess there would be scenes where it's like, oh, the cops come and raid someone's apartment. They raid the doctor's apartment or something, and they find him cross-dressed, and he goes to prison. Which I'm sure that there are novels that kind of fit that description, and they're probably very good and heartbreaking in their own way. But again, that never happens in this book. There's anything kind of happening in the day world is so removed from what's going on in these people's world that, again, it's this weird structuring absence. It's the reason these people can't live their lives the way that they choose to on some level, but it's never direct. It's always about implication. It's always about the more subtle ways that society shapes us. It's about, again, when you're in a relationship, you feel like you need to produce a child, whether that's a real child or a doll. And the way that can make a relationship get messy when you can't actually do that.
Speaking of that, the chapter in the book I was reading that was talking about this book's engagement in fascism mentions the like Italian fascist like getting paid to have children sort of tax, where Mussolini was actually paying families to have children. And so in some ways the book's aligning having a child with dying is again explicitly anti-fascist, but there's sort of like an engagement with the connection between fascism and birthing, at least at the time. Because obviously birthing isn't fascism entirely, but like the fact that we need more people for like nationalistic
back a little
or
bit
something.
Though, like that's really interesting when you think about Djuna Barnes's personal life. Like she never personally had kids. Apparently she like had to take care of a bunch of kids when she was young and hated it. And so she clearly is someone who did make this conscious choice to reject motherhood. And that's, there's something in that I think is very relevant. And I think that, in the context of fascism, like there is this just strange, I can't put my finger on it. Like the Marcus essay I read explicitly says that this is like an anti-fascist, satirical text that is again, by parodying Freud and Wagner and kind of these other patriarchal, I guess you would almost say Apollonian things. It's really trying to deconstruct those impulses, even as it's kind of can't name them yet. Because again, this is being written in the 20s, right? 20s or late 20s, early 30s, I guess. I don't know when it was actually. But
30s.
Again, this is pre-World War II. We did not know how bad the whole Nazi situation was going to get. I mean, I know people had inklings of it, but it had not happened yet. And so
1932 to 33, so, and then it comes out
at that
36.
point. Obviously, the fascists are in power, but again, we didn't know what the full horrors of the camps were going to be at that point. And so it's kind of pointing towards this future, but can't quite name what's actually going to happen yet. But I think there is this tension, this really horrifying tension in this book.
I think she addresses this most like outwit with Felix. Because you have Felix, who's trying to trace his origins back to the greats, and he's very obsessed with his like bloodline, which isn't real, and like how great Austria is, and he struggles for so much of the book to be like, I am important, I'm a baron, and it's like this nationalism is within him. And I think by the end of the book, though, he kind of gives up on it. Like he quits his day job. And I think he stops being out in the daylight and caring as much about his heritage and becomes another night person. You can also see this in his refusal to drink at the beginning of the book. And by the end of the book, he is, fully in the night and drinking all the time and just does not care.
Do you remember when the doctor says, "Oh, you'll come around eventually"? Like, because he's like, I'm not gonna drink. And he's like, that'll change. So
I think that too, crucially, that change comes because his son decides that he wants to be a priest, and so the future of the Volkbein lineage is suddenly kind of taken out of his hands. And on some level, he's given the freedom to be the person he actually wants to be. Because he clearly is enamored with this world. He wants to be part of it, but he's the person who's kind of, I think, like you said, Anna, most strongly kind of pulled between the two poles of the world. And I think that's why he disappears for so much of the book. Is that he's trying to be respectable, and so he does not exist for large chunks of the story.
And they have like a sort of surrogate family there, because it's like at the end it's Felix, Frau Mann, and his kid. And they're just kind of like hanging out at the bar, basically. That's like the last we see of Felix. So one of the great things about Nightwood is like, you can basically talk about almost all of the stuff as much as you want. And I think it is equally a satire of fascism as it is attempting to engage with whatever strands of thought might inform, like, the mood of the time. So,
again, this is just a really amazing book. Like, I just can't believe how dense like this 153 pages is. Again, I
And
feel
we
like we
haven't even
could
talked
sit
about, like,
here, we could talk about this for another 3 hours, and we'd still
Easily.
just be running around in circles. Unfortunately, as much as I'd love to sit here and talk about Nightwood with you guys all night, I don't know if our listeners would. So let's skip a little bit. There's great stuff in between here, what we've talked about, and here we're coming up to the end. But I will say definitely a little bit more. We want to hit the big stuff, and so we got to talk about the ending. Ben, I know you really wanted to take the lead on this, so why don't you kind of get us into the ending, and then we'll start chatting about that.
Yeah, so as we've said, the doctor sort of counsels Nora one more time. He basically tells her to kind of get over herself, and then you see the effects of basically being this sort of reverse Freudian counselor goes on Matthew, and he gets really wasted and basically kind of like passes out on the floor of the bar. And then we get the last chapter, which is sort of like Nora and Robin reuniting along with the dog. And it's written in this incredibly spare style. There's a couple of metaphors, but not as kind of involved and as complex as the ones we looked at. And in this scene, Robin has kind of been getting closer and closer to Nora in America, sort of on her own. And they are reunited in a church. And Nora is basically watching Robin try to get lower and lower to a dog. And the dog is like clearly weirded out. And she's trying to kind of make herself lower and lower to the dog. And Nora is witnessing this. And we just kind of watch it happen. And then it ends. And I still don't really know what to make of this final chapter. I have a couple ideas because it sort of brings together the book's concerns with being animal, with we don't really get a glimpse into Robin, and we don't get like sort of what's going on. And I think what did I wrote? Actually, I looked at what I wrote at the end. I said, "Yeah, I don't know." There's a reference to Matthew saying, "One dog will find both of them," which is basically what happens at the end. And the last chapter is written again, as I said, not flowery. And I feel like there's sort of like, I don't know, almost like Djuna Barnes is pointing towards something that she can't herself articulate, that involves like either lowering yourself so that you're metaphorically and figuratively lower than a dog, or that you can only communicate in like basically animalistic ways and not worry about words. I don't know, like the chapter almost like doesn't solve any of the problems that we've discussed, and it sort of like does like a right angle address to them. And I feel like in some ways it's kind of addressing the book's concerns with like, what does it mean to be an animal, or what does it mean to be a man? And I think the positive reading would be that like in doing this, like lowering yourself, you're incorporating your animal nature and your human nature together. And I like that reading, but it also doesn't account for how sad the end of this book makes me feel, because like the dog is really upset, and like Robin is like crying, and like Nora's watching this happen in her church. So I don't know if it's like a resolution, but I don't know. There's a lot going on there, and I still don't know how I feel about it, but it is like a very powerful final chapter.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I remember when I first read this book. When I first read this book, and I texted you because I learned that you had read the book, and you like immediately asked me what I thought the ending chapter meant, and I was like, who knows?
Yeah.
I can take a stab at it.
Go for it.
I'm with you guys. Like when I first read this, I very much was like, what? And then I was like, oh, that makes me feel bad. Why is the dog upset?
Right.
And just to correct myself, this is actually the shortest chapter in the book, not the Jenny Petherbridge chapter. But just don't want to get emails about how I was wrong. But my stab at like what this means, and again, I'm coming at this from the standpoint like I'm kind of won over by the idea that this is a comic novel, and so I think this is supposed to be kind of one last gag, so to speak, where like this is kind of a parody of the perfect like rom-com ending. It's like Robin wanders onto Nora's property, and she hears Nora's dog, and then Nora lets the dog out, and it leads her to Robin, and they meet, and they kind of realize like, oh, we're really destined for each other. But this is Nightwood. This is Djuna Barnes. We clown in this motherfucker, and so she has to undercut that, like, and it kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier about like the idea that maybe all this stuff isn't reconcilable. Like,
yeah,
even if you accept these feelings, if you try to like accept that you can't do exactly what society wants you to do, you can't cure this weird emotional turmoil you have because of your relationship and because of other things. Even if you accept that fundamental like chaos of life, it doesn't fix anything. You're like, Robin's still a weirdo who behaves like a freak at all like possible times because it's just who she is. And again, we don't get Robin's psychology. We don't understand why she is the way she is. I think that again, this is like her contrariness. She finds herself in this position where it could be this grand romantic moment, and she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to behave in the most freakish way possible because that's just my impulse. I am a fundamentally like contrary person.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think also throughout the book, Dr. Matthew O'Connor talks about how like we should go back more to our animalisticness and the innocence, and there's also a lot of talk about Robin wanting to be innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost wonder if it's just her. I mean, it's obviously her just groveling at the feet of Nora, and I think in that moment, kind of becoming dead to Nora. Like, I think Nora doesn't look at her with the sense that I get is that Nora does not look at her with anything but disgust in that moment. That's my takeaway. That's my personal interpretation. But I think it's like the ultimate innocence of her is to be more lowly of the dog. Oh, and the dog just rejects her as well.
And I think that explains like the fact that the language is so spare too. Like that to me explains, like why Nora's sort of like, okay, why was I in love with you in the first place? Kind of like something like that. Like there's kind of like a stripping of illusion there.
There might also be like a wish fulfillment element to it. This is kind of Djuna Barnes being like, yeah, Thelma, this is what you're doing.
Well,
Very possible.
Also, too, like, do you remember there's like, I think at one point when Nora actually is speaking to the doctor, she remembers like this scene where there's like a Madonna image and there's like a woman in front of the Madonna, and he's like, and she goes, oh, that was us. Like we were in this sort of like too good to be true, like mother-daughter relationship that shouldn't have happened. And then the weird parody, as you said, John, is they're in a church and instead of the Madonna, it's a dog. Like so, like there's kind of like an inversion of maybe like the way that the imagery of the relationship was set up to kind of like undercut what happened. It's still like kind of a brutally sad chapter though. Like I know like I see why it could be funny, but something about like how like the chapter almost feels like hungover or something. It's like you've got this like florid imagery and like this sensual overload, and then like you're just like hungover at the church, like watching the scene. Like it feels like a come down, I guess.
I don't disagree with you. I think it's definitely like it's tragicomic at best, but again, I'm looking at it from the standpoint again of the opening, where it's like it is this parody of again this kind of grand gothic thing, and I think that this is its own kind of parody. Like this is there's almost like a vaguely like maybe Lovecraftian isn't the right word to it, but again, it's this scene of madness, like very like gothic madness that undercuts what again I think would traditionally be, if this was like a regular novel, would be like this very like dramatic, romantic, like coming back together.
Right.
But I think Djuna Barnes is undercutting that, and I like that. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about kind of the way that kind of the literary establishment, for lack of a better word, kind of is always positing the idea that like literature, like every piece of like great literature is a wisdom text, and that you can take away some message from every great book that's going to make your life better. And I really kind of feel like the message of this book is that No, you can't. No, it won't. uh, and maybe it's just where I am in my life, but I don't know. I think that there is something to that. I kind of like the fact that this book kind of rejects the idea that it's going to give you this advice that's just going to like help you like integrate or something.
Along those lines, John, a famous Djuna Barnes quote, which I think aligns with what you're saying, is towards I believe the end of her life, she said, "For most people, life is nasty, brutish, and short. For me, it has simply been nasty and brutish." Things are not going to get better. Yeah, I also too wanted to say that I'm glad we're doing this, because I feel like when people talk about this book, they tend to just go, "I don't know, man," because because there's clearly like a lot happening, and I think talking about it is important, and I think that can be wisdom in itself. But yeah, this book is not going to give you any platitudes nor any like clear-cut answers. It's simply just is. So,
and there's something magnificent about that.
So along those lines, John, I think we should answer: would we put this book in the Infinite Library? Yes or no? John Hagley.
Okay, a little context here, listeners. Ben and I have been talking about the show a little bit. We want to kind of end our thoughts kind of about kind of just summing things up, giving an idea of like whether or not we think this book is worth your time. I think in the case of Nightwood, absolutely is. In terms of the, I hate to put it in like crass mathematical terms, but just in terms of like the amount of like bangers in terms of sentences, jokes, images, like that you can get per page. I can't think of another book I've read in years that like tops this thing. Like 153 pages, and I swear every single page has like something awesome on it. I absolutely think that this this book belongs in anybody's library, unless you suck, in which case don't read it, I guess.
Yeah, losers need not apply.
Yeah, no Jenny Petherbridges need to read this book.
And John, I agree. I think if we're thinking in terms of time and mortality, yes, definitely read this book, bang for buck. But also, I think generally when one thinks about the modernists, it's usually like, I don't want to have to read Ulysses, which is amazing. I don't want to have to read Faulkner, which is awesome. I just want to read something approachable. And I think like this is the best thing, because like besides Virginia Woolf, I think like more people should be reading this. And I think if you want to go deep on the modernists, you can obviously read Joyce and Pound and all the big guys. But I think Djuna Barnes is sadly underlooked, and I think it gives you basically everything else those give you, but in like almost like a supercharged way. And so I think for that reason too, it should be you should definitely give it a read.
Yeah, maybe because it's less mythologized, like this definitely does not feel as intimidating as like reading Ulysses, which not saying Ulysses is better than this by any means, but people make such a big deal out of reading books like Ulysses that like sometimes it is nice to just be like, I got something that I don't have to feel like I need to read a bunch of supplementary materials, even though we did, to understand it.
Anna, what are you thinking? Yay or nay?
I say yay. I mean, I won't get too much into it, but I oftentimes hate the modernists, and this is one of the books that I read recently that made me go, they're all right. They're actually really good. I think it should definitely be on your bookshelf. It's such a short read. There's so much, and I think I'll probably reread it again, and I don't typically reread books, and I think you can reread it as many times as you want and get something different out of it each time.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely going to be coming back to this one in the future.
Yeah, and a note should be said also, we had mentioned this before we were recording, but apparently T.S. Eliot cut some of the sexy stuff out, and you can find that edition that's through the Dalkey archive. And I read it, but I don't remember like what the sexy stuff was. But also, like, apparently you can read about the construction of Nightwood in the Dalkey archive one, and apparently there were drafts of Nightwood that were like 500 pages long. So like apparently like she really cut this down to like a lot of it. And also apparently the squatter chapter actually came after her going to see Matthew the first time, was the original chapter run. So like she's just kind of like, I don't know what to do about Nora, and Matthew's like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he confesses that he was Jenny, and then you get the sort of reveal basically that about Jenny. So yeah. Honestly, that sounds even better, and so it must have been meddling T.S. Eliot who suggested this edit. But
yeah, I did hear that T.S. Eliot edited this, and I am very interested in eventually reading the unedited version.
St. Louis's least favorite son, in my opinion.
You take that back.
Well, I mean, and talking about, self-invention, he moved to Britain and became a British banker, even though he's from St. Louis. So he even adopted a fake British accent, which you could hear recordings of. So
nobody wants to be from St. Louis.
Yeah, where is St. Louis's great modernist writer?
Well, it was T.S. Eliot, and I'm sticking with my my feeling that T.S. Eliot sucks.
Well, should we lay it there? Is there any final thoughts?
I think Anna wanted to do recommendations, so let's give recommendations one last hurrah. So Anna, since you're the guest and the birthday girl, why don't you go first? What text would you pair with Nightwood?
I'm going to be greedy and I'm going to do 3. And I'm not going to be able to explain it very well. I know. In my mind, this makes up a queer canon of its own. And so the first that I'm going to recommend is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Absolutely the same level of heart-wrenching and tragic, and is beautifully on the same level as Nightwood. Giovanni's Room, great, fantastic, also very short. The next one I'm going to recommend is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Less dreary, more fun, and a lot more gender ambiguity in that one. And then I'm going to go way out and I'm going to recommend Passing by Nella Larson. That book is one of the only books by modernist class that I liked. And I think beyond the very obvious talking about race issues in America, I believe it is also has, if you read it the right way, another metaphor in there about bisexuality. And those would be my 3 recommends along with Nightwood.
Yeah, those sound great. I'm especially intrigued by Passing.
Great. I guess I'll go next. Text I'm going to pair with this one is a book that I think is very obviously inspired to some degree by Nightwood. And that is a work by my personal favorite author, Angela Carter. That's Nights at the Circus, which is, as you could probably guess from the title, a book about nights at a circus in kind of a similar time period as this book. And I think being written by Carter, it's post-World War II. And so I think that it's dealing with a lot of similar themes, but dealing with them kind of from the remove of the post-war years of kind of, Carter's writing kind of in the wake of the feminist movement and sexual liberation. Book came out in 1984, so obviously almost 60 years after Nightwood came out. And I think that it's asking similar questions, but it's also kind of coming at it from a place where there's a lot of horror, but also a lot of hope for the future, which I think is something, like we said, Nightwood really doesn't give us. And while like I said, I really like that about Nightwood, I also really like Carter's read, which I think grapples with a lot of similar questions about gender and psychology, but maybe also has a little bit more belief that the world can get better, even if we can't fix everything.
Yeah, that sounds great. I also think that he was called Nights at the Circus, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's like that's like the most Djuna Barnes title I can think of. So yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Well, that's why I was so surprised I never heard of Djuna Barnes, because clearly Angela Carter read everything Djuna Barnes ever wrote. Like, as soon as I read Nightwood, I was like, oh, Angela Carter read this.
Yeah, I really want to read Rider, because that's Djuna Barnes' first book, because it sounds like she basically read Ulysses and was like, I'm going to do whatever my version of that is. So apparently there's like different styles and voices in Rider.
She also illustrated Rider, and also Lady's Almanac. I think Nightwood's the only one of her novels she didn't illustrate. And I saw some of her drawings, and she was also, on top of being, again, an obscenely good prose stylist, was also a really cool like illustrator. It's very kind of like surrealist, like ink drawing, kind of reminds me a lot of like kind of some like woodcut stuff. I don't know. I really like her drawing too.
I believe one of those books was first published under the title of just A Book, which also makes me love her more.
Here is a book. Yeah.
A book. Take it.
Yeah, I think I'll have to recommend Don Quixote by Kathy Acker, not Miguel Cervantes. Kathy Acker is a sort of postmodern, lesbian sort of William Burroughs, I would say, and she does a lot of like weird collage. There's a lot of like bodily, humors. There's not quite the sort of like alien monstrosities in Burroughs and Kathy Acker's work, but it's very like pulpy and viscerally, and it's very postmodern. And in her version of Don Quixote, it's like, what if Don Quixote was just a woman traveling through America? And so there's a lot of just like weird things that happen. It's like a picturesque novel. There's weird references to Don Quixote. It's a very like goopy book. And it's only like 200 pages. So yeah, Kathy Acker rocks. It's probably the only, I would definitely put like that in a lineage with Nightwood. Although I think Don Quixote has a lot more kind of like postmodern-esque stuff, as opposed to being pure modernism. But I think the kind of picturesque vibe, or picaresque rather, is I think a clear parallel.
Awesome. Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us again this week. We had a lot of fun discussing this book. Hopefully our discussion wasn't too wide-ranging or too rambling for everyone to follow. If you like this episode, please let us know. Definitely want to start requesting at the end of the show here, for if you listen, please rate or review us on Spotify or iTunes. Would really help us get the show out to more people, and we'd really love to see more people listening.
Yeah, and John, if we became a little like Matthew O'Connor, so be it. To read Nightwood is to become like Matthew Mighty Grain of Salt Dante O'Connor.
Well, yeah, that's all I have to say for today, except happy birthday, Anna.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy birthday, Anna. Thanks for coming on. Honestly, I don't think we could have done this without you, so I'm glad you were here.
Me too. Now, before we end, you have to say the line.
You gotta say
the line. Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.